presenting very much on behalf of a collaborative project. So Liz works at the Centre for Mind-Land Rehabilitation in this institute, and the collaboration was with the Landscape Ecology and Conservation Group in UQ. Her research team consists of 2 senior academics, 4 postdoc fellows, and they, between them, have considerable experience in landscape dynamics, biodiversity management, restoration ecology, with particular experience in working in the Brigalow Belt, where much of Queensland's CSG industry is placed. Now, Liz is happy to take questions throughout the seminar. The talk will be around about 45 minutes, so questions welcome both within and afterwards. Liz, welcome over to you.
Excellent, thank you very much, Neil. I should also mention that this is actually a scoping study that was undertaken for the Centre for Coal Seam Gas here in SMR, and so this was sort of our results from that scoping study. So this first slide is just showing the CSG expansion in Queensland. So we've just got plotted some of the CSG wells that we have, and as you can see, they really have sort of increased in the last 2 decades. Been quite a substantial amount of expansion in CSG. In terms of numbers, off the top of my head I don't know. There were predictions, we currently don't have this many, but in 2012 CSIRO did make some predictions that with the current operational plans, or the 2012 operational plans, that there would be up to 40,000 wells sunk throughout the lifetime of the CSG. We definitely don't have anywhere near that many at the moment. Just further on from CSG expansion, this is a little graph from a recent paper, and this is also very appropriate to Queensland, or specific to Queensland itself. And it's also showing that mainly in the last decade there has been quite an expansion of CSG production. So with this rapid expansion of CSG in Queensland, there has been environmental concerns, of course. You probably would have heard of various media outlets, but there's also some published mention of potential environmental concerns. One of them is this one, just talking about fracking and potential environmental issues with that. Another source talks about the main environmental problems can be being on water resources, atmosphere, vegetation and land. And I'd like to just quickly point out that CBM stands for methane, which is another term. It's used more internationally for coal seam gas. And another quick statement that I found was that knowledge gaps encompass a range of technical concerns, regulatory concerns and social concerns. So being that there are these environmental concerns, we sort of wanted to have a look at what sort of research, being that there is such a body of concern, what has been done, and in terms of environmental conditions in particular. However, we did find that most of the research was in water and water-related issues. And just to give you an example, earlier this week we did a bit of a quick update to make sure it was nice and relevant for today's talk. I just did a quick Scopus search on what published articles are out there in regards to doing searches on coal bed methane and also coal seam gas and the term water, and that came up with 500. So that brought up 515 scientific articles on using coal seam gas and water as keywords. Also had a look at biodiversity, the term biodiversity in coal seam gas and other sort of associated words. And that, we got a total of 20 hits for that, which is quite paltry in comparison. And because there was only 20 hits with that, I was able to actually quickly have a look at all the abstracts, and I found that actually only 4 of those 20 were actually dedicated research papers on biodiversity of some form. The other 16 were basically just token mentions of ecology or wildlife. So that's previous research. In terms of current research, from what I'm aware of, the main current current research is being done by Jazeera, which is the, I need to read this because I often get this incorrect, the Gas Industry Social and Environmental Research Alliance. And this is an alliance between CSIRO and a couple of just one of the gas companies?
Almost two.
Okay, gas companies, yes. And basically they're looking at two main projects on biodiversity. One of them is priority threat identification and management, and the other one is in regard to potential fire changes in CSG areas and how that will affect fauna and flora. These projects are still quite early in their progress, and I think the last sort of progress card said that they were sort of at 15% completion. So still early days really with current research. Okay, so this lack of knowledge on potential impacts of CSG and biodiversity is a bit of a concern, and I think there's four main reasons for this. Firstly is the rapid establishment of the industry, as I mentioned before, with those graphs on the wells increasing and also production increasing, particularly in the last decade. The second is that there is statements out there by knowledge people that there could be potential impacts to biodiversity. And just to give you a couple, this is quite a vague one, but it's talking about the CSG developments may fragment local habitat. This one's a little bit more scathing, a little bit more in depth at least, and talking about, in terms of overseas CSG already, and that infrastructure represents a serious threat to biodiversity, threatened species and landscape function, and that evidence from CSG developments overseas to date may indicate that severe effects are possible here in Australia. Another concern with the lack of research in biodiversity and CSG is that within Queensland and Australia there is a big concentration of CSG activities in the Brigalow Belt. And just to give you a bit of a map of that, so this is a similar map to what was up before with the wells. The green area in the background is the Brigalow Belt, both the northern and southern sections, so it encompasses quite a substantial amount of southeastern Queensland, I suppose. And what we've overlaid over the top of that is exploration permits and leases in the various colours, but also this is just to show that the pipelines that are running from CSG projects to port also track through the Brigalow Belt a bit too. And the importance of the Brigalow Belt for Australia is, there are various reasons. Firstly, it does, funnily enough, encompass the endangered Brigalow ecological community. There's also quite an extensive history of clearing and disturbance in this area since European settlement. For example, after European settlement, remnant vegetation declined to about 40%, and acacia, to which Brigalow is a type of acacia, to below 20%. And there's also been estimations that the recovery of these areas due to the extent of damage is going to take quite a substantial amount of time if we were to allow that to happen right now. The Brigalow Belt is also the home to various threatened fauna species, several of them endemic or only found in the Brigalow Belt. And in particular, it's because of these sort of conservation values and the extent of clearing previously that it is really important to consider any additional land use changes in the area. The fourth concern with the lack of research in biodiversity and CSG is the range of spatial scales that CSG activities will actually potentially take up or encompass within Queensland at least. Okay, so the range of spatial scales that will be influenced by CSG activities, there's several of them. The first one is a fine spatial scale. And so this is looking at the individual site level of things such as CSG wells or access tracks, processing plants, things like that. And just to give you a bit of an indication, it can be quite a small area, depending on the impact that you are actually assessing. So it's a bit of a diagram of that. The second spatial scale is we move up to the thousands of hectares, and so this is at the landscape scale. And so just to give you an idea, this is a sat image southwest of Chinchilla. And so you can see the individual site CSG wells there, and even though each of those wells and roads will have their own impacts, when you actually look at it at a bigger scale, there's going to be interacting effects there as well. The fourth spatial scale that will likely be influenced is going to be at the regional scale. And so this is going from thousands of hectares in landscape to thousands of kilometres. And I'm just going to take you back to that map that I showed earlier of the Brigalow Belt. So you've got those small sites level impacts, and then you've got the regional, the landscape, and then if you spread them over the whole sort of area, that's how you're going to try and get landscape impacts there. Okay, so with this knowledge that there is a bit of a lack of research in potential effects on biodiversity with CSG activities, the team put together this approach. So what it was, we undertook this scoping study and we sort of had four major tasks that was trying to sort of find out what was actually known on potential impacts to CSG here in Australia on a local note. So what has been done, then identify the knowledge gaps and also try and prioritise some of the research areas from that. So the approach we took, we conducted two types of literature reviews. We had a look at the published scientific literature, and most of that was actually overseas because there's basically nothing done here in Australia. We also reviewed documents by industry, and so this was not only the regulatory sort of documents, but also industry itself, so looking at environmental conditions and also management plans. And that was much more localised, so that was looking at here in Queensland. We also held a stakeholder workshop, and we also invited recommendations from the CSG industry. Lastly, we also did a literature review and case study on using remote sensing to assess potential biodiversity impacts. I'm not actually going to go into that today because it's quite a big topic and it's definitely not my forte. And I'm probably going to waffle on enough today without going into that as well. But Beata is here, so if you have interest in that, please stick around later. Okay, so going back to the literature reviews, I'll just quickly go through them. And I'm going to pop them side by side as well, just because we did do a bit of a comparison between the two. So with the scientific literature, what we did was, so international and local publications, looking at academic and also the government publications to try and get that grey literature that may be out there. And what was happened, various databases, various document databases or literature databases were searched with combinations of all these different words that may relate to CSG and biodiversity. And you will notice that some of the words on the left-hand column there aren't only related to CSG. I mean, we have roads in urban areas or with other infrastructure. But what we wanted to also search for, because there is such a lack of knowledge with CSG and biodiversity, we wanted to also look at other land uses that may be causing similar impacts to what we may see with CSG. So this resulted in 16 dedicated articles. And as you see, they are mainly in the US. There was only one paper here in Australia that actually looked at CSG and biodiversity. So then going over to what I'll call the industry legislation. Excuse me. What we reviewed was, so mainly Queensland-based, but also Commonwealth-based legislation. Also the individual environmental authorities, which I'll call environmental conditions most of the time. And that was of recent leases and pipeline licenses for CSG projects within the Brigalow Belt here in Queensland. And I think we looked over 38 of those ones, just to find out what sort of regulation there was. We also looked at individual CSG industry and company management procedures as well, and this was, we looked at the four main CSG companies that's operating in Queensland, and we looked at their various projects that are happening. And so what we tried to sort of gather from this is that there were actually 5 major potential impacts that were either explained in the scientific literature or that were sort of regulated and trying to mitigate them in the industry literature. And then what I'll quickly do today is just have a brief yes or no of whether we thought it was relevant to the local CSG environment. And given the regulation and management plans, could this be a potential effect here in Australia? Okay, so the first major thing we had was landscape change, and this is quite a broad topic, so I'll just quickly pop up a couple of diagrams. The first one is what a landscape may look like without CSG. So we've got agriculture on the left and some sort of remnant vegetation on the right. There's a road passing through it towards the bottom. There's a little tiny island fragment as well in there. And we've got various edges which are sort of coloured that orange and brown colour. And then with CSG, and this is not to scale, so just to let you know, we're just trying to fit everything into a figure. There can be various landscape changes such as, perforation of that core habitat, increased edges because of increased roads and access tracks, things like that, and also dissection of small patches. And so that's, these are just words that are pretty much incorporated there. So we're talking about potential changes to landscape in terms of direct biomass or habitat loss. We're talking about fragmentation, degradation of habitat as well, perforation and edge effects. And so there's quite a lot of scientific literature saying that that does cause problems with biodiversity. For example, there's also research that says that things such as fragmentation can cause alterations to community composition and organisation. In particular, this paper spoke about how increased density of roads into forests or perforation into forests actually highly increase the number of noisy miners, which even though here in Australia they are native species, they do have an incredibly aggressive and competitive dominance over other native birds and will actually displace them, which then comes back to changing the community organisation. Fragmentation and roads in particular can cause barriers to fauna migration, and so that is that even though there's a road there and it might be quite small, some animals just don't like to cross it even if it's 4 metres wide. And this has subsequent effects for things such as genetic diversity within populations and also between populations of animals. There's also scientific literature to say that CSG can cause quite a broad impact regarding landscape change. And for example, so in the US, in the Powder River Basin, it was estimated that 27,000 kilometres of new roads would be built and also 32,000 kilometres of new pipelines. I do want to point out though that Powder Basin is supposed to have 50,000 wells, so that's greater than what we're even likely to have here in Queensland, so don't get too scared by those figures, but I'm just showing that there is quite a lot of linear infrastructure associated with some CSG activities. Okay, so in terms of industry literature regarding landscape change, the environmental authorities say that, well, they have statements saying that there has to be a restriction of clearing in environmentally sensitive areas. Individual CSG projects' environmental management plans discuss how they aim to minimise fragmentation of remnant vegetation where possible. However, this can be difficult in areas where, unfortunately, both remnant vegetation and CSG resources overlap. And just to show you quickly what I mean by that, at some analysis of data found that approximately 23% of wells were actually within remnant vegetation, so unfortunately where those areas overlap. So the question is landscape change a potential effect here in Australia? Well, yes, absolutely. And could there be an effect to biodiversity here in Australia? Well, potentially yes, but we really don't know because we don't have any information to suggest yes or no as well. So basically there's a big knowledge gap there. The second major theme from the lit reviews was pests and weeds. And in particular that fragmentation of areas increases pest and weed incursion. In particular, there's been work done talking about roads and dominant exotic grasses. And also fragmentation of agricultural areas also increase both foxes and cats as well. And this last point in particular is quite important because those two predators in particular have been responsible for quite a large number of extinctions of mammals in Australia. So in terms of industry literature, this isn't even just industry, this is Commonwealth legislation that all landholders must manage declared pests, and so in Queensland Brigalow Belt the main two are cats and foxes. So that's a Commonwealth legislation. Within the actual individual environmental conditions for projects, it states that CSG companies must develop and implement pest and weed management plans. Within individual project management plans though, we did find that there was some inconsistent implementation of that. For example, in regards to pests, some projects were really excellent at detailing exactly how they both monitored their pests and if there was increasing numbers, how they would effectively manage them. Whereas there were other projects that in their management plans, it was sort of said that because of the transient nature of a lot of pest species, it wasn't feasible to manage them on a local scale and that they would rely more on a landscape or community-based scale to manage pests. The other thing in the environmental management plans is that they were frequently weed orientated in terms of their key performance indicators, and there was very few metric, like quantitative metrics for pests as well. So again, pests and weeds are definitely relevant to Australia. We've had problems with them before with other land uses. And could CSG actually cause a greater effect to biodiversity through these? Potentially yes, but again, we don't really know. So direct harm to or mortality to fauna was the third major theme of the lit reviews. So this looked at things such as road strikes. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this isn't just to do with CSG, this is to do with all roads. So just some stats from the scientific literature, estimated 1 million vertebrates killed in the US per year. In Australia, there's definitely been population pressure on various mammals to do with direct kills regarding roads. Another direct harm that may occur is contamination by water or prey consumption. And this I would just like to read because it's quite specific and I will get it wrong. So this came from a paper which talked about coal bed methane wells in the US and how it contributed to contamination exposure of bald eagles through their predation on contaminated fish in water, presumably. Yeah, so that is scientific literature on that. In terms of in the industry literature, road strikes really aren't in any of the environmental authorities, so the higher regulatory body. However, within individual CSG company management plans, there are controls that are put in to try and limit that. So things such as limiting speed on roads that the company has management of, and also training staff. And they also state that a lot of CSG activities should be happening outside the peak times of annual activity of dawn and dusk as well. In terms of water contamination, I'm not going to go into this very much because it was sort of on the outer scope of our study, being that we were really trying to concentrate on terrestrial biodiversity, and also I'm not a water quality person, so I can't make too many calls on it. There did seem to be a lot of detailed regulations to do with water quality, to do with CSG activities though. The interesting thing with the industry legislation was there was actually other things relating to direct fauna harm and mortality than what is actually in the scientific literature, saying that they're trying to mitigate possible fauna harm that may occur that we don't actually have any scientific knowledge of yet. So it's probably things that are quite logical to us, but there's no science on it. So again, there's a scientific knowledge gap already on these things. And it's just a few things. Things such as fencing, evaporative dams or other water bodies to try and reduce drowning of animals. And this one, which I found quite interesting in particular, to do with fauna detection and relocations when they're going through and clearing land and doing pipeline trenching. And so there's quite a number of strict conditions and management procedures associated with that. Okay, so again, relevant to Australia, yes, and potentially this could happen here in Australia, but again, we don't know. Environmental pollution is the fourth theme. Firstly, that incorporates things such as dust, which has definitely been shown to affect vegetation health. Dust can, some of the scientific literature suggested it's inconsistent whether fauna cares or not. Just as an example, I think there was a study in Tanzania on ungulates, which showed that they do prefer to eat on the non-dusty side of a road as opposed to the dusty side of the road. Whereas there was a study conducted here in Brisbane which said that small mammals really didn't care too much about dust at all. Other environmental pollutants are noise. Typically there's been quite a lot of work done, especially to do with road noise on birds and bats, and most of the time it's detrimental. Vibration is quite a new thing coming up in the scientific literature. We only found one paper on that, and that was talking about how vibration can cause early hatching of reptile eggs, and so that can have subsequent effects on survival rates if reptiles are hatching earlier and smaller. And light was actually found that it can be both beneficial to bats in providing an additional food source or concentrated food sources with insects, or it can also deter many bat species as well. So in terms of industry literature, in the environmental authorities, they say that no emissions must cause an environmental nuisance at sensitive places. And by sensitive places, typically in the Brigalow Belt in regards to terrestrial biodiversity, that means national parks mainly, a few others, but that sort of thing. It also, not talking about biodiversity so much, it also includes a lot of human habituations, so schools and houses and things like that. It also calls that there must be adequate monitoring in case there are any complaints. And it's also really important they develop and implement environmental management plans. And so these environmental management plans that the CSG companies have do use various controls to minimise emissions. They also have quite detailed modelling that happens actually prior to any activities taking place to try and find out how much noise, for example, will be emitted by the various plants and machinery and whatnot, and then trying to limit that to make sure it is underneath the levels. One thing with both the conditions and the management plans, though, is that they do tend to target humans and protected areas. And just to give you an example, only 6% of remnant vegetation within the Brigalow Belt is actually within a protected area. So there is quite a lot of remnant vegetation around that the government regulations don't actually cover. So again, environmental pollution, it's potentially a problem here in Australia, but really, again, we don't know. The last major theme from our literature review was synergistic and cumulative impacts. And so these are impacts that are not, these aren't direct impacts, but they can be in terms of synergistic impacts. It might be consequential effects on the resilience or the survival rates of species. And also on their distributions at a greater scale, which also has to do with cumulative impacts. This is a quick example. Sagebrush in the US, it was found that CSG had cumulative direct and indirect impacts by both habitat loss and also habitat degradation. There's also possible interactions with already existing threats. So that's things like climate change and also for example, that extensive clearing that's already happened in a lot of the CSG areas. So whether there will be cumulative impacts or multiplicative, it's kind of, it's potential, but we don't know. And again, similar to the cumulative impacts, there's the regional scale impacts as well. In terms of industry legislation, prior to April 2013, there was actually a dedicated statement within a lot of the environmental authorities saying that there would be a group set up to actually assess cumulative impacts. That group has now been withdrawn and it's going to be assessed during other sort of reporting requirements. But that's not actually detailed in the regulations of how that will happen. In the individual management plans of CSG companies, most of the cumulative impact discussion revolves around clearing and trying to minimise clearing so that the impact will be less. And this is the limitation, I suppose, of cumulative impacts to clearing is quite understandable in terms of an individual CSG project, because it would be really difficult for individual companies and individual projects to actually assess cumulative impacts at a regional scale at least, due to the spatial and temporal data needs. Like, they don't have access to other companies' sort of impacts as well. So it really does need to be a sort of an overarching sort of company that does that, or overarching, maybe government section, something. Anyway. Okay, so there's definitely relevant to Australia, and again, we don't know what the effect will be, but there is a potential that it will be there. In addition to all those detrimental impacts that are in the scientific literature that I just spoke about, I did want to mention that it's not all doom and gloom. There is potential benefits from CSG activities to biodiversity, but basically there's not much in the literature, mainly because that's another knowledge gap that's out there. For example, it could be that CSG activities actually do provide additional habitat in areas. For example, are the increased water sources beneficial in areas of semi-arid regions? We don't know. And also, as I mentioned before with the bats, is there increased food sources available as well? So the second task that we undertook with our scoping study was a stakeholder workshop. And so basically, we had 25 representatives from these different groups, and we targeted people and these groups in particular for their knowledge of the CSG industry or of biodiversity in CSG areas, so in particular the Brigalow Belt. So for example, the ecological consultants we asked to attend were people that have done impact surveys within CSG areas and potentially for CSG projects. So they would have that intimate knowledge of what's on the ground there. And basically what we wanted from this stakeholder workshop was what these people actually thought were the main knowledge gaps out there, and what sort of questions should be posed in the scientific realm of what should we sort of be looking for. So what happened, we came out with a lot of information that we've tried to, as a team, sort of put into 4 main questions. 2 science questions and 2 management questions. So with the science questions, the first one, it's very big, but you put that many technical people into one space and it's pretty hard to actually get a nice, concise, simple question. But basically it's talking about those things that were mentioned in the lit reviews, that there's multiple scales that you need to consider, there's multiple organisms, multiple land uses, there's all these things that need to be considered when you are actually talking about CSG impacts. And just to give you an idea, this was a bit of a figure that was drawn on our butcher's paper at the workshop. It's just sort of a quick diagram showing sort of those potential cumulative or multiplicative impacts. So each of the lines represents a different type of development, whether that's coal seam gas or grazing or any other type of land use. And yeah, if there's two at the same place, is that additive? Is that, how does it intensify with time? And it's those things that we really don't know. The second science question was, if we manage and rehabilitate CSG activity areas in different ways, do we come out with different outcomes, basically, and different successes? And if so, are there ways that we can actually optimise this during both pre-activity and also during the activities, so that maybe we can even leave a positive legacy for biodiversity? Okay, so the two management questions, these are a little bit shorter, thankfully. First one revolves around trying to improve the communication between science and also practice, basically. And this is definitely not restricted to CSG. This is a problem working in the minerals industry. We see all the time that trying to get effective communication both ways to find out what needs to be done and what we find out is adopted. Basically, there really is a lot of ground to be improved there. And the second thing that came out was there's a lot of data being collected on out there during environmental impact studies and during monitoring and things like that. And it would be great if we can actually collate that together so that it can be used not only for things such as species mapping and also modelling, but maybe it can be data mined for various other reasons, and also maybe that will also help go towards the whole assessing cumulative impacts as well down the track. So the third task that we had in the scoping study that I'll talk about today is the industry recommendations. So basically we went to various CSG companies, spoke to their environmental staff, and we asked them if they could prepare what they thought were the main research needs to do with biodiversity and CSG. And this was done not only because of their sort of intimate knowledge of what's actually happening out there and what they could potentially see as needing to be done, but also, it's really important that not only for our own research support, but also in getting research adopted, that what CSG companies see as being incredibly valuable for research is actually, that's what's undertaken. So there was 4 recommendations from them. Firstly, that there be strategic evaluation of threats. Also that, again, to do with species distribution, habitat, including mapping. Also, as in the lit review, things to do with pests and weeds and things to do with fragmentation and edge effects. And lastly, also the development of some sort of CSG-specific restoration and rehabilitation criteria and also methods. Okay, so all of the last 40 minutes of me talking comes down to this one slide. So basically, from those 3 sort of tasks, we've tried to pull together what the knowledge gaps are, and then by looking at how often they were, or how detailed they were discussed in each of those 3 sort of tasks. If they were discussed in all 3, then it gets a higher priority sort of balloon. And so that's what this slide will show. So the first one, and the main concern of all the tasks discussed was pests and weeds, basically. And that had a lot to do with fragmentation and edge effects. So a lot of these bubbles will actually overlap in various ways, but I've tried to make it kind of simple. So pests and weeds, that came out in basically all 3 in the literature reviews, in the workshop, and also it was acknowledged by both regulators and also industry as being really important. The next line, again, some of these are kind of overlapping as well. I mean, landscape changes, especially to do with multi-scale effects, that has a lot to do with fragmentation as well. Synergistic and cumulative impacts, that's got quite a lot to do with multi-scale effects. And a couple of others that were also just mentioned as well. The next sort of line of research priorities that we found was to do with these bubbles. One in particular that I'll just make mention of is the fauna detection and relocation. Something that's quite interesting about this is that it was talked about quite a lot at our workshop and also in the environmental management plans. However, there's basically no scientific literature that I'm aware of that says that it sort of tells how successful fauna relocations actually are. So it's a really big thing that we do, and it's really important that we do it. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it, but we actually don't know how successful it is. So that's quite a big knowledge gap, I think. And the last line, not of little importance, but just didn't come up as many times in our three major tasks. That communication between science and application, road strikes, whether offsets are actually likely to be applicable to the CSG industry, environmental pollution, and also landscape change in terms of threat evaluation. And it's this last one here that I just want to quickly point out. If you remember back to the slide I had on current research, this is actually the only thing that is currently being done at the moment on biodiversity and CSG in Australia. So we've got all of these knowledge gaps, many which are recognised by various different stakeholders as being really important, but it's only that one that has current research being done. So that's pretty much the take-home message. Just a quick few acknowledgements. This scoping study was prepared for and primarily funded by Coal Seam Gas here in SMI, and great support was given by both Will Rifkin and Helen Schultz, who's here today. Additional in-kind support was provided by both collaborative groups, and we're really grateful for the people that came to our workshop because they all did it on their own time as well. Okay, thank you. That's it.